Okay, let's move on to science fiction. Now, in sci fi, I've gone back to one of my favourite writers of all time, Christopher Priest, another writer that I would nominate as one of the writers that defines me. This novel, The Separation, he wrote in 2002, and it's absolutely terrific. I'm about two-thirds of the way through it, and I'm loving it. It's about two twin brothers who compete together in the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. And then the war breaks, and one of them becomes a RAF bomber pilot, and the other one becomes a conscientious objector, right? So it's about their lives in the Second World War. But there's a problem. And the problem is that the war finishes in 1941. Why? How? And how does it involve these two brothers? I can't put this book down. If I had one criticism of it, I would say it needs a bit of editing. It's quite long-winded as far as Priest goes, but it's such an interesting story. It's such a brilliant portrait of Britain in wartime. It's so clever in the way it works out this alternative time stream where, the Rudolf Hess peace plan, which actually happened, Hess flew to this country to try and create peace. But in this world, it works. But how does it work? And that you keep turning the pages to find out how this is happening. It's such an engrossing book, and it's a great piece of science fiction. It's also a great piece of historical writing, I think. Elsewhere this year, I went back to the classics. I went back first of all to H.G. Wells. I bought this wonderful volume that collects together his first four novels. Do you know, Wells wrote these one year after another. It's absolutely incredible, his output. So he wrote The Time Machine in 1895, The Island of Dr. Moreau in 1896, The Invisible Man in 1897, War of the Worlds in 1898. Four books that basically, let's be honest, created the science fiction genre and gave us myths that we're still talking about and we're still adapting to this day. What an incredible output. Now, I'd already read The Time Machine, which is a beautiful fable. I'd already read War of the Worlds, which is a masterpiece of alien invasion, still one of the best science fiction books on that subject. But I'd never read Island of Dr. Moreau and The Invisible Man. Island of Dr. Moreau was an extraordinary surprise. It is an incredibly gruesome and horrible novel. You know the story. It's about this guy who, through a shipwreck really, he finds himself on this island, and it's run by a guy called Dr. Moreau. And he's experimenting on animals. He's trying to turn them into human beings. And he creates these kind of monsters. And they're setting up this kind of quasi-primitive society on the island. It's an incredibly horrible book, looking at vivisection and, human experimentation on animals and, the sort of hubris of science. And what really impressed me was, A, how horrible it was. This is a horror novel that could stand comparison with any horror novel currently being written. It's relentlessly dour and frightening. There's not a single really likeable person in the whole book. The protagonist is quite a weak, quite scared type of man. He's no Charlton Heston. And he's trapped on this island with Dr. Moreau, who's this kind of evil scientist, and his partner, who is a drunk and was thrown out of, doctoring in England because he was a drunk. And they're the only people in the book, apart from a group of, half, humans, half beasts, mutants. It's an extraordinarily, relentlessly nasty book. I'm amazed that it was read by the public in 1897. But it's also a very intelligent book about, the lengths and the depths that science could go to and what that means for us as human beings. I was amazingly impressed by it. Not a pleasant book, but a brilliant book. On the other hand, The Invisible Man, which he wrote the next year, is a comedy, right? I'd always thought, the James Whale 1933 film, it's very tongue-in-cheek, but it's tongue-in-cheek because the book is. It's a faithful adaptation of the comedy of the book, right? I didn't know that. So all the humour that you get in that first part of the film, where the Invisible Man turns up at this pub, doesn't he, in the winter time, and they're all a bit scared of him, and the landlady's kind of a nervous wreck. That's all in the book. And what the book is really, more than an investigation of science, it's a great big, gentle satire of Victorian society. Really, the Invisible Man is this disruptive element going through all these, local areas, these villages and towns, frightening people. And it gives H.G. Wells a chance to go through Victorian society and take the piss out of various types of people. And it's very funny. It's very jolly. It is about the relationship of the scientist and the public, but not in the way you might think. It's actually, the funny thing about the Invisible Man is he becomes quite evil. He's quite deranged. But the humanity of Wells and what the book is really about comes in right at the end when he dies, and he just comes back as just a normal man, a naked human being, just weak and vulnerable, just lying on the ground. And that's the most powerful part of the book. There's also a wonderful moment where one of the local law enforcement come to kill him, and the Invisible Man gets to him first and kills him, and just before he dies he has this flash of thinking, I really want to live. And it's that humanity, the humanism of the book that saves it from just being a silly little satire and actually makes it quite memorable and quite lovely. Quite an unusual book. I also went back this year to Jules Verne. Now, many people credit Jules Verne as being the father of science fiction, not H.G. Wells. I'm not sure that I agree with that. Because Verne, though there is a lot of scientific fact and knowledge in his books, he's more part of a genre that the French call fantastique. And I saw this in the book that I went back to read. For many years, one of my favourite stories has been 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I first came across the story through this wonderful little children's book, an abridged version with fantastic illustrations on every page. God, I must have read this book about 60 times when I was a child. I loved the story. These men, there's this monster seems to be attacking ships, and these men go tracking it, and then they find themselves on this submarine. There's a wonderful submarine, isn't the Nautilus, your dream place that you'd like to be? And it's commanded by Captain Nemo, this fascinating, aloof figure who's attacking the world's navies for reasons of his own. And I loved the story. I absolutely loved it. And I loved the film, the 1950s film with James Mason and Kirk Douglas and Peter Lorre. That's one of my favourite sort of childhood guilty pleasures. But I thought I've never actually gone back and read the Jules Verne novel. And I've read Jules Verne before and enjoyed it. Journey to the Centre of the Earth is one of the best adventure novels I've ever read. So I thought I'd read it. God, I was disappointed. And frankly, I was a bit bored. The problem with reading 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, after you've seen all the adaptations of it on screen, what you find is it's unusual for a book in that there's very little conflict. Right? You're fascinated by Nemo, but in the book he's just this aloof figure, this kind of authority figure. He doesn't have much character. What you find is that none of them have much character. Right? There's almost a sort of P.G. Wodehouse thing between the scientist who's the main character and his butler, sort of valet. There's almost a kind of P.G. Wodehouse Jeeves and Wooster type thing going on, but without the jokes, without the laughter. And those two and Ned Land, our three heroes on board the Nautilus, don't really have much character. And the whole thing is really, it's like a boy's adventure to tell them about the sea. So Jules Verne throws in all sorts of lists of all the animals that have been recorded under the sea and what type of animals they are and what type of fish they are. And it's really, the whole book is a novel that is designed as an exploration of this wonderful realm of the sea. Now, if you're interested in oceanography or aquaria or whatever, it's lovely. But if you're looking for an adventure novel with lots of, conflict and interesting ideas and touches of the adult, it's a bit of a bore. It's a book directed at the 8-year-old who's just discovered starfish or mollusks or giant squid. And I'm not that anymore, sadly. Another slight disappointment before we move on from science fiction was this. I'm a great admirer of Brian Aldiss as a writer and as a commentator on science fiction. So when I saw that there was this omnibus of stories that curated by him, I grabbed it. Very disappointing. There's a couple of good stories in here, but I found that I don't really agree with Aldiss's taste. You know what? He has a taste for that kind of very sort of heavy metal 50s style of science fiction, which has got very moralistic, looking at, the Cold War and how the, nuclear bombs can destroy the planet and the world we're in today, all that sort of thing. And I found it a bit dry. A lot of the stories he picked just didn't really appeal to me. It got better towards the end, some more interesting work towards the end as we get into the sort of new wave of science fiction. But I'm afraid I found it a bit of a damp squib, this omnibus. I think it could have been a better selection of stories. Okay, let's turn our attention to ghost stories and weird tales. Now, those of you who are interested in that kind of thing can't help but have noticed the British Library volumes on this. There's tons of them, isn't there? Beautifully produced books with very well selected groups of stories, I think. This one is Polar Horrors, stories set in the North and South Pole. I'm still reading the first story, actually. I've only just started it. And it's by James Hogg. I don't know if you know that name. He was a Scottish writer from about the 1820s. Wrote a wonderful book called The Confessions of a Justified Sinner. Really very good book. This is a very obscure story, a little novella that he wrote. And it's not really a horror story. What it is, it's about this guy. He gets shipwrecked in the North Pole. He's the only survivor when his boat goes down. And he somehow miraculously survives. He gets a little cabin on the ship and he can make a fire and he's got some food. And then what happens is he kills a female polar bear and he finds that she's got a cub and he takes pity on the cub and he takes this young female cub in. And in a rather strange turn of events, they become friends. And the way it's written is that this female polar bear is almost his wife. They have these adventures together. And suddenly, the bit of ice he's on breaks off and it becomes this moving ship. And the whole thing, I think, is a kind of interesting allegory of man in the universe and his relationship to nature and other animals. And it's quite sweet. Him and Nancy, his polar bear's called Nancy, go off on these adventures together. And then this giant polar bear comes after them and Nancy defends him. It's great fun and it's beautifully written. Hogg was a really great writer, often wrote in that kind of Scots vernacular. And I'm really, really enjoying it. I hope the other stories in the volume are as good. I think the most important anthology I read this year was this. Daphne Du Maurier, Don't Look Now and Other Stories. I've never read Daphne Du Maurier before, so I thought that was a bit of a gap in my reading. So I turned to her. And the first book in this anthology is Don't Look Now. Now, Don't Look Now, as you'll know, is a very famous film directed by Nicholas Roeg, starring Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie. It's a film I've been fascinated by for many years. So I was really intrigued to read the origin story, the original text story, and I got a bit of a shock. What I've always thought about the Nicholas Roeg story is this. It starts brilliantly, doesn't it? That fantastic opening sequence, that weird sort of dislocation of noise and effect, and he seems to be seeing visions, and at the end you'll realise that he can see into the future and all that sort of thing. Then you get the wonderful interplay between Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie, so beautiful, so sensitive, that fantastic sex scene, best scene in the film, this wintry, atmospheric Venice. And then it gets bogged down in plot, doesn't it? You remember? She goes off to look after their son who's got ill in private school, and he's left alone in Venice. And then he sees his wife on a boat, and he says, "What's going on?" And he goes to the police. And that part of the film is really boring. And I blamed Roeg, and I said, "You've got bogged down in plot, mate." When I went back to read the original story, that bit, the bit when he sees her on the boat and goes to the police, that is the story. That's the story that he's adapting. All that other stuff that we've loved for years is Nicholas Roeg. All it did was make me appreciate the film all the more and realise what a masterpiece it is. What happens when a great artist, a great director, takes a fairly middle-class anecdote, really, that's what it is, and makes something beautiful and sensitive out of it. The original story is so disappointing. What I found with Daphne Du Maurier is this. All of the stories are about holidays or people away from their usual realm, fishes out of water stories, right? They're not all necessarily supernatural or weird. And what I thought about them was, I don't think you could say that this is great literature. I don't think she's a particularly great prose writer. In fact, she always goes for the mechanics. right? What I mean by that is she's a great page turner. You really get involved in the stories. You really want to keep reading and find out what happens next. So she's interested in getting the reader, putting them in a place, and putting them through the mill and giving them a good time, giving them a good story, and any kind of literature or meaning or extra is abandoned really in favour of that. So she often goes for cliche or stereotypes or people who are immediately knowable to get you through the story. It's all about page turning. So I understand why people like Daphne Du Maurier, because it's really good fun to read, but I don't think there's much afterwards. You don't really think much about it. The most successful story in those terms is A Borderline Case. This is a story about this young girl. Her father dies, and she becomes interested in this friend of her father's. They used to be very close, but now they've split up, and this friend has got a mysterious kind of reputation around him that he went mad or something. She finds out that he's living in Ireland, and so she goes over to Ireland to visit him, and she finds he's this recluse who lives on this island in a lake and has his own sort of private army. You can kind of see where he's going. That was the most interesting story. A very unpleasant ending, which I'm not sure that I totally went with, but that was the story that most involved me. So if you want a good read, definitely, if you want something at your bedside that will, it will entertain you, definitely recommended. If you want something more than that, I wouldn't recommend it.